So how many of you got here on your Segway today? Wonderful technology. Not everything that can be done should be done. By the way, feel free to come up, walk around, do whatever you want during my presentation, but try to hold questions to the end just because I'm recording it to put it on the website. But at the end, I'll take any questions that you have. So, the usual fun out of the sun in Las Vegas, but I ran into Craig Kuttner on the afternoon of my second day, and he noticed the Band-Aids on my feet, and so he thought that was a good picture to take. This was a picture that Adam Wilk took. You'll see a bunch of pictures from him, very appropriate to Las Vegas. This was something I took a picture of in one of the concession stands. It's a fake fish and chips newspaper, except the concession stand wasn't a fish and chip stand, it was just a hamburger stand. And then this is a little interesting. What didn't arrive, this is Pixel Power's disaster recovery booth. They had the misfortune to pack their booth in a shipping container that was selected for random radiological survey, which takes several weeks. So they had to build a booth from scratch and discovered just how much interconnectivity is required and many, many trips to Prize. And then this was Waze's booth. This is on the second day. It looks like they've got the booth. They've even got boxes of whatever, but they weren't there. Two other things, RTNDA, typically part of NAB, not this year. And no coffee restrictions at Snell. Snell has always had the best coffee at NAB, and it used to be only one of the Snell people could get you and take you back to where the espresso machines were. Now anybody could do it. Analog lives. This is a company that has humbuck coils, and they were doing a good business at the show. This is NAB's map of the North Hall. NAB tries to have anchor tenants in each hall. So here the anchor tenants are Harris, Everts, and Ross, which is getting bigger. And then right after the show, Harris said, well, we're getting out of the business. But two other important parts of the North Hall. North Hall is always my favorite hall. One I'm going to show you is this area over here, and the other I'm going to show you is this area over here. So that one on the left, NAB, as you know, is all work. So there was the karaoke lounge and the gaming lounge. Yes, that is Zoltar from the movie Big. But it is all work. You can see the very serious expression on his face there. And lest you think this was only in the North Hall, this was in the Central Hall. Take a bounce on us. International Research Park. This is truly my favorite part of NAB. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Skip, I think, is back there. Yes. Great job, you guys. There is magnificent stuff in this area. One company that was there called GoHDR.com, they're saying high dynamic range is the future of video. And how high a dynamic range? Well, they're doing 30 bits per color. That's 2 to the 30th power amount of dynamic range. And then they compress it 150 to 1 so that you can deal with it. Project Fine, I'll be talking about this later. By the way, anything that's in yellow is something I'm going to talk about later. But Project Fine is this thing, stands for Free Viewpoint Immersive Networked Experience. And the only bad thing about it is currently the processing is about 10 seconds per frame, but they're thinking maybe by next year they'll get down to real time. But basically they take just a few cameras in, say, normal stadium locations. They don't even have to be ringing the stadium or anything like that. And from the different viewpoints of those few cameras, they calculate the complete 3D space of the stadium and then can place a camera anywhere in that 3D space, including looking straight down. And I'll show you an example of that later. Zaxcell systems, they were showing 4K in 60 megabits. They say 15 megabits is coming, and they are currently making 2K 3D 120 frame per second players for Doug Trumbull. And then NPR Labs, we've been talking mostly about television, but radio is really important too, and they were showing captioned radio. Not quite sure what the difference is between that and text. An electronic brailler, this is if you don't have sight, you can hold your finger on something and different braille letters will occur on it. And then this, I thought, was one of the most brilliant things at the show, a bed shaker. If you have someone who's hearing impaired or visually impaired, how do you get them the alert? You know, flashing lights, ringing bells, whatever. You shake the bed. And then they go to the caption radio or the electronic brailler. And then my favorite thing in the International Research Park, NICT, which is Japan's National Information and Communications, National Institute for Information and Communications Technologies. And just to refresh your memory, this is what I showed you 3 years ago at NAB 2009. They were my favorite exhibit then because they showed live holography. And I'm showing only the receive part of the live holography. Here's a big arrow to tell you roughly where to look, and then here's a smaller arrow to tell you where to look, because that's the hologram, and it's about the size of my pinky nail, and it had a viewing angle of about 2 degrees. And it looked like the worst YouTube video you'd ever seen. But it was live holography, which is very exciting and in full color. They also showed a multi-sensory system with 3D visuals, stereo sound, and tactile feedback. You would hold a pen in midair, and yet you would feel that you were rubbing it over a coin or something like that. Well, this year they had the multi-sensory again, still 3D visuals, still stereo sound, but now 3D stereo sound, and now tactile, not only push but also pull. You could pull the pen out of a balloon until you were bursting it, and then when you burst the balloon, you smelled what was inside it. So they've added smell. But the more exciting thing to me was this: no glasses, viewpoint shifting, 200-inch 3D. And this is a picture that I shot off the screen. Those people are looking at it. It's 3D, it's no glasses, it's 200 inches. That's all pretty straightforward. But it's viewpoint shifting. So if you're on the left side of the screen, that's what you see of this car. And if you're on the right side of the screen, or you walk over to the right side of the screen, you look into the car. And it's very, very simple technology. 200 projectors, but, well, 200 projectors is not such a big deal these days. You can buy a projector for $200. And there's lots of melding software to align them. It's not that difficult. It's a diffusion screen. They call it special. And then there's a condenser lens in front. That's very special, having a 200-inch condenser lens. But unlike the live holography, this is something, if you wanted to put it in a venue, you could do it tomorrow. This is ready to go. This is pretty exciting. Not a home thing, but still the idea that you have 3D, and when you do this, you see something different. That's pretty special. Helicopters. This was the show of helicopters. Helicopters were not new at NAB. There's been one guy in the central hall by the restaurants, and he's had helicopters for years and years. But this year, helicopters, dual rotors, quadricopters, hexacopters, octocopters, your own drones, blimps. This guy had a helipad with LED lighting so that your helicopter, which doesn't have anyone in it, can see where to land. This helicopter is about 6 feet long. That is a full 7-axis stabilized 2/3 inch broadcast camera mount on it. These are smaller ones, various sorts. But the special show price, the lowest one I saw, was $349. So, wow, that's pretty good for the helicopter, and then you add your own camera to it. Except when I got home from the show, I had a Brookstone catalog, and this is what they were showing in it. 2 quadricopters. This is the indoor version. That's the outdoor version. Less than $300, including the camera and 2-way RF, and you control it from your iPad. Lockheed Martin not only had helicopters, but they also had this drone that you can have of your own, and this blimp. And the blimp is controllable up to 1,200 feet. It does not have any lights on it. Is this a wonderful idea to have in our airspace? People who are pilots have also told me that the FAA came up with a regulation that you cannot use any of these helicopters for commercial purposes. So I'm not quite sure what that means. Second screen. You heard about mobile DTV from Lynn, so I won't go into that. But how we deliver is either mobile DTV or broadband, the over-the-top, the confusion that Lynn was talking about that Jim Berger had. What do we deliver it to? Well, we could deliver it to this, which is maybe the world's largest laptop, or to a tablet, or to a smartphone. But just here's a mobile DTV thing. I just want to point out, this is looking at the same picture on both. Well, you can sort of make out where I'm standing, that there's some people there. Even over here, I can't make out what's on that screen. So can we deliver the same material no matter what size the screen is, whether it's this, or this? That's Amberfin's business for changing that. And then where do we deliver it to? Well, do we deliver second screen to the home? Sure, why not? Here's a typical home viewing situation, and mom is reading the newspaper, and maybe this kid is doing homework, and who knows what this kid is doing. Dad is sitting backwards, so he's clearly not going to watch the TV. But at the Technology Summit for Cinema that SMPTE ran, they had a whole session on second screen for cinema. Do we want to have second screen for cinema, where the whole purpose is to look at one thing and have a community that's looking at one thing? Okay, ways of going beyond HDTV for the future of broadcast television or future of any form of television. Extended color gamut. Not much talk about that at the show, except concern about XVYCC. XVYCC is an extended color gamut that exists now in many consumer products. So they're pushing the button and saying, okay, I'm going to extend my color gamut to what it should have been, except we haven't said what it should have been. We don't have any way of dealing with that yet. There was discussion of color gamut in laser projection. The reason for extending color gamut, pick any one of these triangles for NTSC or whatever you want, they all exclude all of this range of saturated turquoises, and there are other colors that are excluded. So it would be nice to get some stuff. Higher dynamic range. Red introduced the Dragon sensor upgrade, and it goes to 15 stops. Very impressive, considering that Ari is only talking about 13 stops in the Alexa, and most broadcast cameras maybe 11 stops, 10 stops, something like that. Except, as I mentioned, GoHDR, their motto is 16 f-stops is not enough. And so again, they're going to 30-bit, which is effectively 30 f-stops. Now, Red's Dragon sensor, I should also mention, can at 6K at up to 85 frames per second, or it'll do 120 frames per second at 5K. Now, going from 5K to 6K, they had to make the sensor a little bit bigger, which unfortunately means that there are some motion picture lenses that will cause vignetting on that sensor. So, no problem, you'll just get new lenses. And then 3 more areas of beyond HDTV: 3D, higher frame rate, and higher resolution. I'll talk about that. By the way, this is from GoHDR on their dynamic range. This is something being welded. That's properly exposed for the weld, and that's properly exposed for something else, maybe the window that's over there. So they combine all of that, and you can get it in one picture. Okay, 3D. Camera & Pace Group had a big booth where they were showing 5D. And what's 5D? It's 2D plus 3D coming out of the same truck, or even coming out of the same camera position. Last year I told you about the shadow system that was done with Pace and Fujinon. They mount 3D cameras on top of a 2D camera and then control it in different ways. It can converge as you zoom in, or not converge, or go to a certain limit or not go to a certain limit. Dolby 3D is yet another definition for Dolby 3D. Dolby 3D used to be the interference filters that they used for their viewing system. Now it's processing for each display type. Very great idea that you have different processing, not such great implementation. They had a demonstration where everyone was supposed to be excited, 3D without glasses. Sure enough, they had 3D without glasses, and it was very high resolution, which was exciting because normally autostereoscopy has lower resolution. But it had virtually no depth in anything they were showing. The logo had the most depth. More autostereoscopy all over the place. I came up with a theory that all 3D demonstrations are bad. And my theory was proved wrong, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later. But 3D space creation was interesting. I mentioned a little bit about Project Fine. Here is a system from Camargus. This is 16 cameras. That's the result. They stitch them all together, and then you can position a camera anywhere you want in there and look at different stuff. Caliber had 3D warping, so you can have multiple projectors on different shaped screens. You can see this screen is kind of sticking out, and it warps it properly in stereoscopic 3D. And then 2D to 3D, you may recall JVC was one of the first companies to have an automatic 2D to 3D converter. This year they said, okay, it doesn't really work that well. So they're saying, go through our converter automatically and then have someone fix the stuff that doesn't work at a workstation. Shutter angle. This was something I found enlightening. This was the very last session at the Technology Summit for Cinema. And two groups in the session, Park Road Post, which is where Peter Jackson does his stuff. That's where they're located. This is Wellington Harbor, and there's WIDA Digital, Park Road Post, the Portsmouth Hire, and Stone Street Studios. So that's basically the heart of New Zealand production. And Fraunhofer, they both did tests of different frame rates and exposures. Now, you would expect that a higher frame rate will look more video-like, and it did. So no question there. But what was shocking to me was that changing the shutter angle or the exposure from 270 degrees to 360 degrees, so changing it from 3/4 of a frame duration to full frame duration, made it much more video-like at any frame rate. Whether you were looking at 24 frames per second, 48, or 60, going from 270 to 360 had much more of an effect on making it look like video than going to the higher frame rate. The other slightly interesting thing in that demonstration, they had a sword fight, and people were seeing the swords distorting. They were kind of bending, and they were saying, "Ooh, what's causing the bending in the swords?" So you have to say they were toy swords and they bent. Now, Fraunhofer did a similar kind of thing, except theirs was derived. So they shot everything with an Alexa camera, 356-degree shutter angle, 120 frames per second. And then if they took one set of frames down, that would simulate 24 frames per second at a 72-degree shutter angle. If they took 3 down and combined them, that would represent a 216-degree shutter angle at 24 frames per second, and then they did other things like alternating eyes at 60 frames per second. And interesting things there, one, the longer the exposure, the less the stereoscopic depth. So another strange thing was shutter angle. If you went from 72 degrees to 216 degrees, the depth decreased with no other change. Cameras in the same location, converged on the same point, and so on and so forth. And then the other interesting thing was doing this alternating left eye, right eye, which is what happens in the movie theaters. You saw ghost images. They were shooting a boxing gym, and people were doing this, and their hands would become ghost-like when they had this situation of the alternating frames, even though what they were shooting was exactly matching what they were displaying. So higher frame rate, definitely a reduction in the alternating eye 3D motion artifacts. Makes things look more real or more video-like. Is that always a good thing? Even Doug Trumbull at one point said, not necessarily. But nevertheless, equipment is becoming much more available. Sony introduced this NEX FS700U camera. It's less than $8,000, and it'll do full HD to 240 frames per second. It has a 4K sensor in it, although there's a question about 4K. I'll talk about that in a moment. So far, a low percentage of cinemas can show this stuff. So The Hobbit is going to come out at 48 frames per second, and nobody knows how many cinemas are going to be able to show it yet. Nice thing about higher frame rate is it's a multiple of the raw information rate. So if you're going from 24 frames to 48 frames, everything doubles. But that means you have less blurry pixels because you have more frames, and there's less change between frames. So those combined, you get easier motion estimation, and whether this even requires any additional data rate for compressed video remains to be seen. It may be able to be compressed into the same data rate that we're using now, possibly even into less data rate than we're using now. And then, again, the best 3D demo, I was working on this hypothesis that all 3D demos are bad, and it failed. At Christie's booth, they showed Cameron's high frame rate 3D demo, and it was perfect 3D. It was absolutely magnificent. But it took place entirely inside a room around a table. So we're not talking things in great distance. There's an alternative for eliminating some of the motion artifacts. This has been shown for a while, but it was at NAB for the first time. It's called the Tessive time filter, and it's basically an LCD filter that you stick in front of your lens, very simple to use, and instead of using a 180-degree shutter, you use a 360-degree shutter, and then this thing has sort of a Gaussian on-off time. So that's what the 180-degree shutter would look like, and that's what it looks like with the Tessive time filter. And it eliminates a lot of the aliasing. There's been a lot of discussion about what's actually going on. Some people don't believe what Tessive's saying, but everyone believes that there is an effect, and it seems to be a beneficial effect. So now, going beyond HD resolution to 4K or 8K or something. So here's 4K demonstrations. You're getting more detail. So if that's HD, that's 4K. You can do reframing afterwards. So if that's your original shot and you say, oh, damn, I wish I had the stuff over here, you can move that down and capture that. You can do image stabilization. If you were moving stuff around and you wanted to get this HD shot, currently the image stabilizers give you this HD shot, and if you shoot 4K, you can get the full HD shot. There's also single sensor 3D. I talked about this last year. That's the Z-Par 3D lens on a Phantom 65 with both eye views on a single sensor, so you don't run into sensor problems. Cameras are now available from many companies. The ones in white are actively selling them. The ones in red introduced them at NAB. The ones in dark gray have had something but haven't really shown it yet, and the ones in green have vaporware, except Panasonic has a history. When they show vaporware at an NAB, they tend to show the real thing the next year. So that's something to consider. Now, all of that is cool, and it's handy for production, but what does it do for the viewer at home? Well, this is what happens for the viewer at home: increased sharpness. By the way, right after NAB, 4A announced, oh, we're coming out with a 4K slow-mo camera. And at this point, I should probably say there is a question of what is 4K. If you have a regular broadcast camera, you have 3 HD sensors in it. In all of these 4K cameras, you have one sensor. And in many cases, that one sensor is a 4K sensor. So it's 2K by 4K, but then it's got a color filter on top of it. And is that delivering 4K? How do you do proper optical filtering for both luma and color when you have a color filter on it? Sony's camera, the F65, has a 20 megapixel sensor. So closer to deriving 4K, but theoretically you should have 3 8K sensors to get 4K, and no one's doing that yet. So a little bit about resolution and viewing distance. There is always a perfect place to see resolution. As you get farther from that peak, you lose resolution because you're getting farther away, you don't have the visual acuity. As you get closer than that peak, you lose resolution because you can't see the forest for the trees. You're seeing the scanning lines or the pixels. 20/20 vision is defined as 30 cycles per degree. A cycle has a white part and a black part. NTSC had about 480 lines, so if we take 480 lines, divide it by 60 lines, which is 30 cycles per degree, we get 8 degrees. Work out the trig. That turns out to be the ideal viewing for someone with 20/20 vision is 7.15 times the height of the picture. And for 1080 line HD, that would be 3.16 times the height of the picture. Well, people said, that's great, you just sit that far from your TV. But we don't sit from TVs at any distance related to how much resolution they have. We sit from TVs at a distance related to where our furniture is. And our furniture is in a room, and the room has a certain size. So Bernie Lechner, a researcher at RCA Laboratories, did a study to find out how far people sat from their TVs, and what he found was it's 9 feet plus or minus very little. And that was in the tube era. If we go to flat panel displays, that actually increases the distance. Well, that means there's a seeming lack of need for even HDTV, because if we take a 25-inch TV set, that's 15 inches high. If we're looking at it from 9 feet away, there's an 8-degree viewing angle, then the height is 15.1 inches. So NTSC resolution matches 20/20 vision on a 25-inch TV set at the Lechner distance. So why do we have HD? For 1080 lines to be visible, we should have a 70-inch TV. Well, the reason we have the HD is because resolution is not that important. Nobody says, "My, would you look at the resolution on that picture?" People say, "No, look at how sharp that picture is." But sharpness is not the same as resolution. Here is a modulation transfer function curve. The modulation is contrast in this case, so contrast is increasing in that direction. Fineness of detail is increasing in this direction. And the shape of the curve is going to vary according to many factors, but the psychovisual sensation of sharpness, if you believe Otto Schade at RCA Laboratories, is proportional to the square of the area under the curve. And if you believe Eric Heinacher from Zeiss Laboratories, it's proportional to the area under the curve. Either way, the area under the curve is very significant, whether it's the square of the area or just the area. So when Sony introduced HDCam and Panasonic introduced DVC Pro, they made a compromise. They cut off the resolution at a certain point, which meant they would lose lots of resolution. DVC Pro HD in 1080 line HD chops 1920 down to 1280. You're losing 1/3 of the resolution out here, but practically no area under the curve. And because you're getting rid of practically no area under the curve, you're preserving most of the sharpness, which is why today, in 2012, the London Olympics, the official recording format is DVC Pro HD. They will not have more than 1280 pixels per line coming out of that, and yet it will be acceptable because we will get most of the sharpness. So sharpness improves with 4K regardless of what the person at home is watching it on. They can be watching it on an old black and white NTSC TV. They'll get more sharpness. They can watch it on an HD TV. They'll get more sharpness. This is a big difference between all those other things that I mentioned in Beyond HD and 4K or 8K. 4K can help other TVs. 3D, you need a 3D TV. Higher frame rate, you need a higher frame rate TV. Extended color gamut, you need an extended color gamut system. But 4K or 8K, the higher resolution will give you higher sharpness on any TV.
But Mark,
yes?
Is the curve always that way where it tails off?
Yeah, the exact shape of the curve.
Hardly anything.
Right, I'll show you some real-world curves in a moment. Okay. The exact shape of the curve, as I say, is going to vary according to many factors. But here are some real-world curves. These were shot using two old Canon still cameras, the EOS 10D and the EOS 20D, and the difference between them is just a 14% linear increase in photo sites. 4K is a 213% linear increase, so vastly more. So there's the MTF curve for the lower resolution camera. There's the MTF curve for the higher resolution camera, and yes, they do both just trail off into nothingness at the end. So what does that mean in terms of sharpness? Well, here's the sharpness, and you may or may not be able to read things, but I think almost everyone in the room can see that the one on the left looks sharper than the one on the right. It's not a question of more resolution. There's only 14% difference between the two of them, but there's more sharpness there than there is there. That's one of the advantages. Now, of course, there are going to be disadvantages also. There's more data rate and so on. So now let's get into the products. The 5 categories: acquisition, storage, processing, distribution, and presentation. Acquisition, mounts. Most exciting thing to me was not a new product, but the fact that both Cambotics and FX Motion have gone to Ross. The nice thing about that is, A, Ross is a North American company, and B, Ross has maybe the greatest customer service policy of any major manufacturer. So I like that a lot. Telemetrics introduced this televator, a robotic column. P&S Technique had this micro 3D rig. It's a mirror rig, so this is sort of the first real mirror rig that you can handhold. 3Reality had the TS5 last year, but that was kind of big. This one's really nice and small. Now in lighting, many more LEDs. Here's one of them, the Xylight Fresnel, and you can't really make it out too well from this picture, but it's about that thick. So maybe 2 inches thick, maybe not even that. But new forms of lighting introduced, plasma lighting. Here's a Hive plasma light. I'll show you a little bit more about that later. That's the bulb for it, and it's excited by an RF field at 450 megahertz. So no matter how high you go in frame rate, no one's going to get anywhere near 450 million frames per second. So you got a ways to go. And then tracking. This great company, Cast, has this product called BlackTrack 6D. The 6D is it tracks things in 3 dimensions in space, but it also tracks the yaw, pitch, and roll of the object. So if you're projecting something onto it, it'll adjust the projection. They demonstrated it with a slot car that was racing around, and they had a spotlight tracking the slot car, wherever it went, based on infrared pulses that were coming off. And then optics. Ira Tiffin sold his filter business, but he hasn't gotten out of it himself. So he brought some new filters to the cinematography group, and this is one of them called an anamorphic purple flare filter. And that's the result of what it does. And then we have this new lens that was shown by Fujinon. It's a 97 by 8.5. And I said, wow, that's really great. That's nice and wide. And he said, oh, do you like that? Would you prefer 8? Well, yeah. Well, would you prefer more than 97? Well, okay, but I don't really need it. They haven't really made this lens yet. They were showing a mock-up and trying to get people's information about what they thought was. So a little bit more about LEDs. This is something that PRG, Production Resources Group, came out with. They said LEDs have problems because they have narrow band emission, and that's a problem for various cameras, and they also change color, and if you have an LED blow and you change it, you may have different light coming out. So they say, why do we need to deal with that at all? We'll just have blue LEDs, and they will hit phosphors, and the phosphor will emit the light. And that also gives you a totally diffuse light, so you don't need to put diffusion material over it, and therefore you don't need to cut down on the amount of light. They have this one, which is kind of a soft light, and this one, which is a harder light. And then a little bit more on that plasma. There's the plasma bulb. It has no electrodes. It's stimulated by RF at 450 megahertz. It's got some gases in it. It's already being used by Hive, Robe, and Sea Changer, and it's from a company called Luxim, which is in California. There's another company in the UK that's making plasma bulbs. Here's a different form of plasma. This is the manufacturer of the bulb. It's called Eden Park Microplasma, and it's basically kind of like a plasma TV, except with no TV. It's just putting out white all the time. And this is a new light from Zacuto that uses the Eden Park microplasma in it. Now cameras, the big news of the show was Blackmagic Design's cinema camera, and there it is. It's 2432 by 1366, so they call it 2.5K. 13 stops of dynamic range, they claim. But this is interesting. The size of the imager is 15.8 by 8.9 millimeters, which means it's smaller than 4/3, smaller than the size of the imager in a Panasonic AF100, but larger than Super 16. And you can get it with either an EF or a ZE lens mount, so you can use those lenses if you want. It has an integrated battery. Now, it's a very good battery. It's supposed to give you 90 minutes of full use time and charge up in 2 hours, but it's integrated. So if you use this camera for 90 minutes, you then have to plug it in. You can't change the batteries on it. It has a solid-state drive, and that does pop out. It has a 5-inch 800 by 480 touchscreen, and it's very intuitive. It's like using an iPhone. It has HD SDI and Thunderbolt and USB outputs, and it includes DaVinci Resolve software, which is normally about $1,000, and Ultrascope software, which is normally about $700, and the whole plus Media Express software, which manages to put the HD onto USB, and the whole thing is $29.95. How good is it? We don't know. Is it ready to use? Absolutely not. You probably need more things to stick on, at the very least a lens. Maybe you're talking a $10,000 package by the time you're done, but that's not so bad. You know, $10,000 is $7,000 less than the basic RED camera, and that's before you add the stuff that the RED requires. In regular cameras, Sony, they showed this at IBC, but it was introduced at NAB for the first time, the HTC 2000, 2500, 2550 series, which Alex Shapiro at Sony's press conference said was the finest broadcast camera available. And I am here to tell you that he was damning it with faint praise. This is the most magnificent broadcast camera I have ever encountered. It is 12 dB better than the 1500. That's 2 stops. You can shoot in 25% of the light at the same amount of noise. Or you can look at a scope and see noise that you have never seen since the HD era began. It's amazing. Plus it's got all sorts of other bells and whistles. This is a gun. That's a stand for holding it. Actually, that's just a plastic model of a gun. But this is not a model. It's a camcorder. And it's from a Chinese company called AEE. And not only is it a camcorder to shoot whatever you're shooting with the gun, but it has a built-in laser to, quote, frighten the goal, close quote. What most people were excited about at JVC's booth was their 4K camera, and I'll show you that in a moment. But I like this one, the GY HM650 camera. It's a news-gathering camera. It's got a built-in 23 power lens. It's multi-format, whatever form you want to edit in, DNX or ProRes or whatever, it'll deal with it. It's got dual codecs, so you can do a proxy recording while you're doing your main recording, built-in file transfer protocol, built-in Wi-Fi, and well under $6,000 list price. A lot of stations were very excited about that for news. Some other cameras that people were talking about, the Canon EOS 1D. It's another in Canon's series of DSLRs that you can use for shooting HD, except this is maybe the first one that seems to have been designed as a video camera. This is that Panasonic mock-up of the 4K, but again, the year after Panasonic shows a mock-up, they usually show a real thing. This is JVC's 4K camera, which is $5,000. And this is Sony's entry into the little cameras, the NX30. It's less than $2,000 and has probably the widest angle of any of the cheap cameras. Storage. What do you do with what you've shot? Well, you can give it to someone else. So 2 organizations at NAB this year, USC, the University of Southern California, introducing the USC Digital Repository. You give us your stuff, we'll protect it for you, plus we'll put it online and you can have it whenever you want. Fuji, sort of introducing PermaVault. It's their version of cloud storage. The reason I say sort of introducing is they introduced it in the medical industry previously. So they're introducing it to the broadcast industry. You pay them a fee per terabyte per month, and again, they deal with the archive. You don't have to worry about what it's archived on. You don't have to worry about migration or anything. They'll deal with all that, and you have online access. Optical, another company trying holographic, H-Vault. This was something actually very practical. JVC's SR HD 2500 US. It's a Blu-ray recorder with HD SDI input. So you can finally record to Blu-ray and don't need any encoders or anything like that. I think it's $2,500 or something, but I can't remember exactly. Maybe $3,000. Sony introduced this optical storage system. It's based on blue laser discs, but it takes 12 discs, puts them in a single cartridge. You shove the cartridge in there, and then you can record or play on anything that's on any of the discs, and you have roughly Blu-ray disc capacities and I/O. Other storage stuff, obviously many 4K recorders. This is AJA's Key Pro Quad, which is one of them. And then this was unusual. Last year, there was an awful lot of handheld recorders. Now all of those companies are introducing rack mount recorders. So AJA's Key Pro is now available in a rack mount version. Cinedec has the MX and the RX. Fast Forward Video's Sidekick Studio HD. Sound Devices Pix 260. All of them intended to be rack mounts. So I guess they're realizing that broadcasters and people with studios and facilities can use this stuff. But we're in the era of tapeless. Must it be archived on tape? The Blue Disc Optical seems to have too low an I/O. It's fine for finished product, but not necessarily good for something that you're going to be working on later. Solid-state drives, great, but too expensive. Hard drives, not that long-lasting. So personally, I was looking for some solutions at NAB, and I was hoping to talk to the people about RDX. But even though RDX is archival for more than 30 years, it's from multiple sources, it has hard drive access speeds because it is a hard drive, there was nobody at NAB this year that had RDX. None of the companies were showing it. And then this, Group 47, they took over Kodak's development of DOTS digital optical technology system. They say archival for more than 100 years, non-magnetic, immune even to electromagnetic pulses, but they weren't at the show either. But this was at the show. Panasonic introduced Micro P2, so it's an SD card form factor for P2, but has all of the other usual P2 benefits, the high data rate, throughput, and so on and so forth. Processing. Quantel had Revolution Q, and that's their vision of it. What's most exciting to me about it is they're using commercial off-the-shelf processing and storage, which is unusual for Quantel. Oral Sonic, last year I told you about House 119, which is these acoustic panels that have group delay built in. Oral Sonic seems to be showing the same thing this year. There's inexpensive, motion compensating, high definition frame rate conversion now. Snell can give it to you for around $36,000, Caliber for less than $30,000. Lots of people talking about H.265, which is the high efficiency video codec, and built into the standard is 7680 by 4320, which is NHK's version of 8K at 120 frames per second. And then there's that space-time creation that I was talking about. This is the Project Fine, and this is a camera looking straight down. You're seeing high-definition video of the players on the field, except there's no camera up there. That's just derived from the 3D space that a few cameras at the top of the stadium are showing. This is a 40-camera GoPro Hero rig, which using Digicave can give you those shots where, somebody leaps up in the air and then the camera spins around, does that kind of thing. There's compact routing. Now Sierra Video is doing what Blackmagic Design was doing. So this is a 32 by 32 router, and I think that's 2 rack units, and that's how thick it is, about less than an inch. And lots of people looking for alternatives to Final Cut Pro because of what they did. Distribution. Belden came out with a new mic cable. And what's special about the mic cable? Well, this woman is sitting in this chair, and the chair is suspended by a mic cable. And then they piled bricks in the chair. And the mic cable still held it. And when it broke, it was always at the connection. Belden also introduced completely waterproof BNCs. And, unusual for Belden, because they bought Telecast, they introduced a fiber intercom system. So there's their intercom system. It's compatible with either Clearcom or RTS, and you can use either matrix systems or 2-wire systems. AJA introduced T-Tap. You stick Thunderbolt over here, and you get HDSDI coming out over there. Advanced fiber products join the list of some of the other companies that have normal through optical switches, or in this case I call it a normal optical patch. So there's a patch panel, and it works just like an old style patch panel. You stick in the optical thing, and it either normals or doesn't normal depending on where you stick it in. Sony introduced this NXL IP55 3 HD systems over IP, gen-locked, and you can either have all 3 going in one direction or 1 going one way and 2 going the other way. And then lots of people in unlicensed 5 gigahertz, LancerLink Skywave HD, this is for camera HD, and I tried messing it up. I tried covering the transmitter and seemed to work very well. $5,000 for a camera receiver pair, another $2,500 for each additional receiver. And then Leon had this intercom system, belt packs or base stations, again in 5 gigahertz wireless. This is the switch, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. Based originally in New York, it was a means of the New York broadcasters controlling their own routing and not having to pay switch fees to New York Telephone or Verizon. Now they've expanded, and this is an uncompressed HD network that goes to all these places in Canada, the US, and London. This was an interesting thing from Toshiba. They call it the NP engine, and it's hardware that accesses your solid-state drive directly. So if you're streaming, you can do up to 64,000 streams, up to 40 gigabits per second per system, and it doesn't affect the server CPU at all or the server memory at all. So there's a space reduction of 70% and a power reduction of 77%. But does it work? Well, this was introduced by Pixelmetrics, and it's a way of checking video streaming by acting the way that we act, which is not starting the stream and letting it go to the end, but starting it and then stopping it and then starting it again and switching channels and coming back in, and it tells whether your system can handle all that. Presentation. This is the long view. Toshiba had this 3D LED screen, so I said, oh great, let me look at it. And they said, okay, see that man over there in the blue shirt? Go to him and look at it from there. This is the short view. Was talking about the advantages of 4K and 8K in terms of sharpness? Absolutely. But NHK says that one of the advantages of super high vision is the immersion, the sense of presence that you get. And so they say you get that presence when you watch it at 0.75 times the height. Well, very simple math. If 9 feet is the viewing distance, what is the height that 9 feet is 0.75 of? It's 12 feet. So your TV set has to be 12 feet high, which means that it's a 294-inch TV, or 24.5-foot TV if you prefer. I like the headline that PC World did when they ran this column. Panasonic's newest prototype TV is too big for your living room. And that's only the 145-inch version, but it is 8K. But it works fine in a movie theater. This is Ari's graph, and this is again based on 20/20 vision. Some people might have vision that's better than that. Everyone in front of these green lines can see 8K resolution. And everyone in front of these red lines can see 4K resolution, and even this person way in the back of the theater can see 3K resolution, which is more than HD. So there are places where even the resolution is going to be significant. Another thing, presentation viewfinders. Here is an LCOS, or liquid crystal on silicon, 1920 by 1080 viewfinder from BandPro. Whether you can see that in a viewfinder remains to be seen. Here is a viewfinder from an Estonian company called Kinotechnik, and this is just one of their menus for the viewfinder. Presentation projection. Panasonic introduced the PT DZ21KU. It's a 20K lumen projector, the world's smallest 20K lumen projector, because it uses 4 465-watt UHM lamps. UHM lamps were previously available only in 220 watt. And then lots of discussion of laser projectors, question of whether this red laser projector is intended as a consumer product. Now, they showed a 3D presentation. They warned us in advance there was going to be lots of ghosting. There was lots of ghosting. So I can't tell you what the color range looked like because it was in a dystopian society where everything was almost black and white. I can't tell you how the 3D was because the ghosting was horrendous, but I can tell you that the stuff that I would expect to be a problem from a laser projector, which is speckle or visibility of scanning, was not there. So that's encouraging. And here's the warning they had on their laser projector: dangerous thinking, delusional deadlines, grandiose goals, and so on. Presentation 5, Canon. Canon had a 4K reference display. What's Canon doing with the display? They've actually made displays for quite some time. And then finally, this is at the urinals at the Las Vegas Hotel, which used to be the Las Vegas Hilton. And now I will be happy to take any questions.